I woke up to someone gently touching my shoulder. At first, I thought it was a dream, but then I felt his breath on my neck. This wasn't my boyfriend. This wasn't some random stranger. This was Grayson, my mom's husband, and he whispered my name like he had every right to say it. But let me back up, because everything that happened next, well, it all started the night before. A night that seemed normal, harmless even. My mom had left for a conference out of town. It wasn't unusual. She traveled for work a lot, but this time felt different. She trusted Grayson and me to stay in the house alone, our new house in the countryside, far from the city, far from everything familiar. It was the kind of house that looked perfect on the outside. Huge glass windows overlooking a quiet lake, modern furniture, and that eerie kind of silence that feels heavy rather than peaceful. Grayson had always been the perfect stepfather. Too perfect, maybe. His clothes always freshly pressed, his hair neatly combed back, and his words always polite, always measured. He wasn't the kind of man who raised his voice, but there was something about him that never sat right with me, something I couldn't explain. That night, after Mom left, I thought I'd just retreat to my room, maybe binge some Netflix until I fell asleep. But Grayson insisted we have dinner together. It'll be nice to have some company, he said, flashing that perfect, practiced smile. I agreed, not wanting to seem rude. We sat at the kitchen island, the only light coming from the warm overhead lamp that cast long shadows on the walls. He talked about Mom, how proud he was of her, how lucky he felt. But every time I looked up, his eyes weren't on his plate. They were on me, and not in the way a stepfather should look at his stepdaughter. At first, I convinced myself I was imagining it. But as the night wore on, his gaze lingered a little too long. His compliments felt a little too personal. When I laughed at one of his dumb jokes, he reached out, touching my hand just slightly, too slightly to call it out, but enough to make my skin crawl. When the clock hit 11, I made an excuse. I'm tired. Think I'll head to bed. But the truth? I was uncomfortable. So uncomfortable I didn't even go to my room. Instead, I curled up on the couch in the living room, where the massive windows looked out over the dark, empty lake. I thought the openness would make me feel safer, as if the shadows outside were less threatening than the man inside. I didn't even remember falling asleep. But somewhere deep in my sleep, I felt it, that soft touch on my shoulder. At first, I thought maybe I was dreaming. Maybe I had imagined the whole dinner, the weird glances, the uncomfortable silence. But then I felt it. His breath. One. Too close. My heart started pounding so loud I was sure he could hear it. I kept my eyes shut, praying it was just a misunderstanding. Maybe he was checking if I was okay? Maybe he thought I needed a blanket? But then he whispered my name. Rena. It wasn't the way you'd whisper someone's name to wake them gently. No, it was something else entirely. Something that sent a chill down my spine. I stayed perfectly still, my mind racing. What do I do? Should I pretend to wake up? Should I run? Should I scream? And then, he leaned closer. I could feel the heat of his body next to mine. You shouldn't be alone here, Rena, he murmured, his voice deeper than I'd ever heard it before. It wasn't the voice of the polite, perfect Grayson I knew. It was something darker, something dangerous. I wanted to bolt. Every muscle in my body screamed at me to get up and run. But I was frozen, paralyzed by fear. And before I could even process what was happening, he did something that made my blood run cold. And trust me, what happened next? It only got worse. You won't believe where this story goes. I lay there, frozen, feeling his breath on the back of my neck, his words echoing in my mind. You shouldn't be alone here, Rena. But just as suddenly as it started, it stopped. Grayson pulled away. I heard the soft creak of the floor as he stood up. I kept my eyes shut, heart pounding so loudly I was sure he could still hear it. The faint sound of his footsteps retreating down the hall was both a relief and a new kind of terror. Was I imagining this? Had I been half asleep, misreading everything? But when I finally forced myself to open my eyes, I saw it, the faint impression of where he had sat on the edge of the couch. The fabric was still warm beneath my fingertips. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. Morning came too quickly. The soft light filtered through the floor-to-ceiling windows, casting long streaks across the polished wooden floor. For a moment, I tried to convince myself it had all been a bad dream. Maybe I'd overreacted. Maybe I was just exhausted. But then I stepped into the kitchen. There it was, a single coffee cup, still warm, sitting on the counter. Grayson's favorite black mug with a tiny crack along the handle. And that familiar, sharp scent of his aftershave lingered in the air, mixing with the faint aroma of freshly brewed coffee. I wasn't imagining it. I grabbed a glass of water, my hands trembling slightly as I tried to steady myself. Just as I brought it to my lips, I felt it, that sensation of being watched. I turned sharply, and there he was. Grayson stood in the doorway, his hair slightly tousled, as if he'd just woken up, though his eyes were too alert for that. He wore a casual t-shirt, his arms crossed over his chest, looking every bit the relaxed, perfect stepfather. But his eyes, there was something different in them. "Morning, Raina," he said, his voice smooth, casual, as if last night had never happened. "Sleep okay?" I forced a tight smile. "Yeah, fine." We stood there for a moment, the silence stretching between us like a taut wire. Then, as if nothing was wrong, he moved past me to grab his coffee. "I was thinking," he began, leaning casually against the counter, "if you need help with that project for your college class, I've got some free time today." I almost laughed. Really? After everything that happened, he wanted to play the helpful stepdad card? "I'm good," I replied quickly, trying to keep my voice steady. "I've got it under control." But Grayson didn't miss a beat. "Are you sure? It's not a problem. I've got some experience with presentations. Your mom always says I'm good with this kind of stuff." He smiled, that same polite grin that had always seemed so genuine before. But now it felt like a mask, a facade. I mumbled something about needing to make a phone call and bolted from the kitchen, my pulse racing as I stepped out onto the back porch. The cool morning air hit my face, and I took a deep breath, trying to calm the rising panic. The lake stretched out before me, calm and serene, but even in the fresh air, I couldn't shake the feeling of his eyes on me. I glanced back through the kitchen window. He was there, standing by the sink, coffee cup in hand, staring straight at me. Our eyes met for a split second before I quickly turned away, pretending to check my phone. My heart hammered in my chest. Was he always like this? And I just never noticed? The rest of the day passed in a strange blur. Grayson acted like nothing had happened. He moved around the house, fixing things, making small talk, asking about my classes. He even offered to cook lunch. But every time we were in the same room, the tension was suffocating. When I handed him a plate, his fingers brushed mine, lingering just a second too long. I jerked my hand back, but he didn't even flinch. He just smiled, as if testing me, watching to see how far he could push. Later, when I was sitting in the living room, pretending to scroll through my phone, I caught him watching me again. His gaze wasn't casual. It wasn't the glance of a concerned parent. It was something else, something darker. His eyes drifted from my face, down to my lips, lingering there for just a heartbeat too long before he looked away. I wanted to call my mom. I wanted to scream, to tell someone what was happening. But what would I even say? "Hey, Mom, your perfect husband is creeping me out?" She wouldn't believe me. Grayson was her world. The man who rescued her after my dad left. He was the good guy. No one would believe me. I tried to stay in my room for the rest of the afternoon, door locked, headphones in, but even that didn't feel safe. Every creak of the floorboards outside made my skin crawl. When evening came, I thought maybe I could just go to bed early, lock my door, and pretend the day never happened. But then he knocked. "Raina," his voice called softly through the door. "I was about to start a movie downstairs. Thought it might help pass the time without your mom here." I held my breath, saying nothing, hoping he'd just leave. But he didn't. "Come on," he coaxed, his voice low, patient. "It's just a movie. No big deal. I'll even let you pick." I didn't know what terrified me more, the idea of going downstairs or the idea of refusing him. My mind raced. If I stayed locked in my room, he'd know I was afraid. And if he knew I was afraid, who knew what he'd do next? So I forced myself to answer, "Yeah, sure. Give me a minute." I stared at myself in the mirror for a long moment before heading downstairs. My reflection looked pale, my eyes wide and on edge, but I couldn't let him see that. The living room was dim, the glow of the TV casting flickering shadows across the walls. Grayson sat on the couch, remote in hand, looking perfectly at ease. Like none of this was strange. Like we were just two people killing time on a quiet night. "I picked something light," he said as I sat down on the opposite end of the couch, making sure there was as much space between us as possible. "Didn't think you'd want anything too heavy." I didn't reply. I just focused on the screen, pretending to care about whatever mindless movie he'd put on. But I could feel him. Every minute that passed, the tension grew thicker. I could feel his eyes drifting toward me, could sense the way his body shifted subtly closer with each passing scene. At one point, he reached for the remote, his arm brushing against mine. The contact sent a jolt through me, but I forced myself to stay still, to not give him the satisfaction of seeing me flinch. I kept my gaze glued to the screen, my heart pounding in my chest. I thought maybe, just maybe, if I could make it to the end of the movie, I'd be safe. But when the credits finally started to roll, and I reached for the blanket to cover myself, he did something I never expected. He reached out, his hand landing gently on my knee. "Reina," he said softly, his voice barely above a whisper. "You don't have to be so tense around me. We're family." My stomach twisted. I wanted to scream, to shove him away, but I was frozen. "You know," he continued, his fingers brushing slowly along my leg, "your mom doesn't really understand you the way I do." That was it. I snapped out of my paralysis, jerking away from him so fast I almost fell off the couch. "I'm tired," I blurted, my voice shaking. "I'm going to bed." I didn't wait for his response. I sprinted up the stairs, slammed my bedroom door shut, and locked it behind me. But even as I sat there, my back pressed against the door, I knew this wasn't over. Not even close. I couldn't believe he actually said it. "Reina, I see how you look at me. Don't pretend there's nothing between us." Those words echoed in my head the entire next day, replaying like a broken record I couldn't shut off. I tried to convince myself I misheard him, that maybe I'd twisted his words in my head because of how tense everything felt. But deep down, I knew. I hadn't imagined any of it. I avoided him as much as possible, but in this house, there was nowhere to really hide. Every hallway felt too narrow, every room too small. I kept to my bedroom as much as I could, but even there, I felt exposed, like he could be right outside my door, listening, waiting. I jumped at every creak in the floorboards. By noon, my nerves were shot. I needed to hear a familiar voice, someone who could ground me back to reality. So, I called my mom. Hearing her cheerful voice on the other end of the line almost made me burst into tears. She was so happy, rambling on about how great the conference was going, how she'd nailed her presentation, how much she missed us. Us. As if everything back home was perfectly normal. "How's everything with you and Grayson?" she asked, her voice light, unsuspecting. I froze, the words catching in my throat. Tell her, I thought. Just tell her everything. But I couldn't. She sounded so proud, so carefree. The idea of shattering that for her felt like stepping off a ledge. What if she didn't believe me? What if she thought I was overreacting, or worse, trying to cause problems between them? "Everything's fine," I lied, forcing my voice to sound steady. "Just busy with school stuff." She didn't notice the hesitation. We talked for a few more minutes before I hung up, feeling even more alone than before. That evening, Grayson acted like nothing had happened. Like he hadn't whispered those words in the dim light of the living room the night before. Like he wasn't systematically unraveling my sense of security in this house. He made dinner, humming softly to himself in the kitchen, and called me down like we were just two people sharing a meal. I stayed in my room until I couldn't take the smell of food wafting up the stairs anymore. My stomach was in knots, but I hadn't eaten all day. I sat across from him at the table, barely touching my food, while he talked about his day like everything was normal. But every time I glanced up, his eyes were on me, that same unsettling look lurking beneath his calm exterior. After dinner, I tried to make a quick escape. "Going somewhere?" he asked casually as I slipped on my jacket by the door. "Just for a walk," I muttered, hoping he'd let it go. But of course, he didn't. "I'll come with you," he said, already grabbing his coat before I could protest. I wanted to say no. Every fiber of my being screamed at me to refuse. But the way he said it, the quiet finality in his voice, it wasn't a suggestion. It was a decision. We walked in silence along the narrow path that snaked around the lake. The air was cool and crisp, the fading daylight casting long shadows across the water. The stillness should have been calming, but instead, it felt suffocating. I kept my eyes on the ground, counting my steps, willing the walk to end. But Grayson seemed in no hurry. He strolled beside me like we were old friends enjoying a quiet evening. His hands tucked into his jacket pockets, his gaze occasionally drifting toward me. When we reached a small clearing overlooking the lake, he stopped. "You know," he said quietly, his voice low, almost thoughtful, "I'm not who you think I am." I froze. His words felt like a trap, but I couldn't help but glance at him. He was staring out at the water, his face calm, but his eyes, there was something different there. Something dark. I couldn't read it, but it made my skin crawl. "What are you talking about?" I asked cautiously, my voice barely more than a whisper. He finally turned to face me, and I felt the ground shift beneath my feet. His gaze locked onto mine, intense and unblinking. "You think I'm just your mom's husband," he said, his tone soft but laced with something sharp underneath. "But I see you, Reina. I've always seen you." I felt my stomach twist into knots. I wanted to run, to put as much distance between us as possible, but my feet wouldn't move. His words pinned me in place. "You don't have to pretend," he continued, stepping closer. "I know you feel it too." I took a step back, my heart pounding in my chest. "You're insane," I whispered, my voice trembling. But he just smiled. A slow, knowing smile that sent chills down my spine. "Am I?" he murmured, his eyes never leaving mine. "Or are you just afraid of what this means?" That was it. I turned and bolted down the path, my footsteps pounding against the dirt as I ran. I didn't look back. I couldn't. I just ran until the house was in sight, my lungs burning, my mind racing. When I finally slammed the door behind me and locked it, I collapsed against it, my body shaking. But even as I sat there, gasping for breath, I knew this wasn't over. Not even close. The next day was worse. I tried to avoid him, but Grayson made sure we crossed paths. In the hallway, in the kitchen, in the living room, everywhere I turned, he was there. And every time our eyes met, that same unsettling smile tugged at the corners of his mouth. I was trapped, and he knew it. By evening, I was on edge, my nerves frayed to the breaking point. I needed to get out of the house. I didn't care where I went, I just needed to breathe. But as I grabbed my keys, Grayson appeared in the doorway, blocking my path. "Going somewhere?" he asked, his voice calm, almost amused. "I need some air," I snapped, trying to push past him. But he didn't move. "You don't have to be afraid of me, Reina," he said softly, his eyes dark and unreadable. "I'm not going to hurt you." I glared at him, my fists clenched at my sides. "Then get out of my way." For a moment, he just stood there, his gaze locked onto mine. Then, slowly, he stepped aside, his smile never fading. "Go ahead," he murmured, "but you'll be back. You always come back." I didn't respond. I just shoved past him and slammed the door behind me, my heart pounding in my chest. But as I walked down the driveway, trying to calm the storm inside me, I realized something terrifying. I wasn't just afraid of Grayson. I was afraid of what might happen next. And deep down, I knew the worst was still to come. I barely slept that night. Every creak of the house felt like a threat. Every shadow seemed to stretch longer, darker. But nothing prepared me for what I found the next morning. A note, sitting right there on my pillow, as if it belonged. "I know you feel the same. We could be happy if you just let this happen." The words were scrawled in Grayson's precise handwriting, the same neat script he used to write birthday cards for my mom. But this wasn't some harmless message. This was a line crossed. No, obliterated. I stared at the note, my mind racing. He had been in my room, while I slept. My skin crawled at the thought. How long had he stood there, watching me? That was it. I couldn't take it anymore. I needed to get out. I threw a few clothes into a bag, my hands shaking as I zipped it shut. I didn't have a plan, not really. I just knew I needed to leave, to get as far away from Grayson as possible. I'd go to my friend Claire's house, or maybe just drive until I found somewhere safe. Anywhere but here. I slung the bag over my shoulder and crept down the stairs, trying to be as quiet as possible. The house was eerily silent, the kind of silence that makes your ears ring. I held my breath, praying Grayson was still asleep or out running errands. But when I stepped into the kitchen, there he was, sitting at the table, his fingers wrapped around a coffee mug like he'd been waiting for me. His eyes met mine, and for a second, neither of us said a word. Then he smiled. "Going somewhere?" His voice was calm, almost amused, but there was something in it, something hard, like steel beneath velvet. My heart pounded in my chest. I tried to steady my voice, to sound braver than I felt. "I'm just going to Claire's for a bit." But Grayson shook his head slowly, setting his mug down with a soft clink. "No, Reina, you're not." The finality in his voice hit me like a punch to the gut. He wasn't asking. He wasn't suggesting. He was telling me. "Move, Grayson," I snapped, my fear bubbling over into anger. "I'm leaving." But he didn't budge. He just sat there, his eyes locked onto mine, that infuriating smile never fading. "You're not going anywhere," he repeated, his tone lower now, more dangerous. "We need to talk." I felt the panic rising in my throat. No more talking. Without thinking, I turned and bolted toward the front door. But before I could reach it, his hand shot out, grabbing my wrist in a grip that was too tight, too strong. "Let go of me." I screamed, struggling against him, but he didn't flinch. "Reina," he hissed, his face inches from mine, his breath hot and heavy. "You need to stop fighting this. We're meant to be together." I yanked my arm free with a burst of adrenaline, stumbling back. My heart was racing, my mind spinning. This can't be real. This isn't happening. But it was. And then, just when I thought things couldn't get any worse, I heard it, the sound of a car pulling into the driveway. None. For a split second, relief washed over me. She was home early. She'd see what was happening. She'd stop him. But Grayson didn't look surprised. He didn't even flinch. He just smiled wider, like he'd been expecting this all along. "Let's see how this plays out," he whispered, and then he stepped back, his entire demeanor shifting. The hardness in his eyes vanished, replaced by that familiar mask of calm, loving husband. The front door opened, and there she was as my mom, her suitcase in hand, a bright smile on her face. "Rena, Grayson, I missed you both so much." I stood there, frozen, my mind screaming at me to say something, to tell her everything. But Grayson got there first. "Hey, sweetheart," he said, his voice dripping with warmth as he crossed the room to greet her. He wrapped his arms around her, pressing a kiss to her temple like the perfect husband he pretended to be. "We were just talking about you." Mom laughed, oblivious to the storm brewing in the room. I couldn't wait to get home. The conference was great, but nothing beats being here with my family. I stared at her, willing her to see through the facade, to notice the tension in the air, the fear in my eyes. But she didn't. "Rena, what's with the bag?" she asked, finally noticing the duffel still clutched in my hand. I opened my mouth to answer, but Grayson beat me to it again. "She was just about to run off to Claire's," he said with a chuckle. "But I convinced her to stay and welcome you home properly." Mom smiled, completely buying the lie. "That's sweet of you, honey. Stay a bit, catch up with us." I felt like the walls were closing in. My chance was slipping through my fingers. "Mom," I blurted, my voice shaky, "I need to tell you something. About Grayson." Her smile faltered, confusion flickering across her face. "What do you mean?" Grayson's eyes narrowed, but he didn't say a word. He didn't have to. His silent threat was clear. "He's not who you think he is," I said quickly, the words tumbling out in a rush. He's done things, Mom. Things that aren't right." For a moment, the room was silent. I could see the wheels turning in her head, the doubt creeping in. But then, just like that, she laughed. "Rena, don't be ridiculous," she said, shaking her head. "Grayson would never do anything to hurt you. You must have misunderstood." "I'm not misunderstanding anything," I snapped, my voice rising. "You don't see it because you don't want to. But he's not who he pretends to be." But she just sighed, setting her suitcase down and rubbing her temples like I was the problem. "Rena, I know things have been tough with school and everything, but you can't just make up stories like this. Grayson has been nothing but good to us." I stared at her, disbelief washing over me in waves. She didn't believe me. She really didn't believe me. Grayson stepped forward then, placing a comforting hand on her shoulder. "It's okay, sweetheart. She's probably just stressed. We'll figure it out." I couldn't take it. The walls felt like they were closing in, suffocating me. I grabbed my bag and headed for the door. "Where are you going?" Mom called after me, her voice tinged with frustration. "Somewhere safe," I shot back, slamming the door behind me. But as I walked down the driveway, my heart pounding in my chest, I knew this wasn't over. Not even close. I thought my mom would save me. When she came home earlier than expected, I felt this tiny spark of hope ignite inside me. I gathered every ounce of courage, every trembling word, and told her everything. I laid it all out, the late-night whispers, the lingering stares, the notes he left on my pillow like it was some twisted game we were both playing. I expected her to gasp, to hold me, to apologize for not seeing it sooner. I expected her to throw him out of the house, to stand by me. But instead, she just sighed, crossing her arms over her chest. She looked at me like I'd just told her the most ridiculous joke. "Rena, what nonsense is this?" she said coldly, her voice sharp, cutting through me like glass. "Grayson loves me. He's always treated you like a daughter. You're just making things up for attention." I stood there, stunned, my skin burning with a mix of shame and rage. She didn't believe me. "Mom, I'm telling you the truth," I cried, my voice shaking with desperation. "Why would I make this up?" She raised her hand sharply, cutting me off mid-sentence. "Enough. I don't want to hear any more of this. You're an adult now, Rena. Stop with the drama." But the worst part wasn't her disbelief. It was when she called for him. "Grayson, can you come here for a second?" she called over her shoulder, like she was asking him to check a leaky faucet, not confront the man I just accused of violating every boundary imaginable. He walked into the room with that same mask of politeness he always wore, like he hadn't been tormenting me for weeks. I braced myself, expecting him to deny everything, to defend himself. But he didn't. Instead, he looked me dead in the eyes and smiled. That slow, confident, knowing smile. "Reina's just been under a lot of stress," he said calmly, turning his gaze to my mom. "She probably misses her dad. I've been trying to help, but I guess she misunderstood my intentions." That was it. No denial. No apology. Just a subtle, calculated shift of the narrative. And the worst part? My mom nodded like she believed every word. After that, everything changed. Grayson stopped approaching me. He didn't leave notes, didn't touch me, didn't even look at me the way he used to. But that didn't make it better. If anything, it made it worse. Because now, every time I saw him moving around the house, calm and collected, I knew the truth. And worse, I knew he knew I knew. My mom acted like nothing had happened. She avoided any conversation that even hinted at what I'd told her. Every time I tried to bring it up, she'd roll her eyes and say, "Still making things up, Reina? When are you going to grow up?" Weeks turned into months. And still, she didn't believe me. Grayson kept living under our roof, his every quiet step a reminder of what had happened. But I wasn't naive anymore. They thought it was over. But they were wrong. It started small. Subtle things only I would notice. I began moving things around the house, just enough to make Grayson question his memory. A mug left on the opposite side of the kitchen. His keys not where he left them. His favorite watch missing for a day before reappearing exactly where it should have been. At first, he didn't react, but I saw the flicker of confusion in his eyes when he realized something wasn't right, and that was enough to keep me going. Then I escalated. I started leaving notes. Little slips of paper tucked into his pockets, his briefcase, under his pillow. They weren't obvious threats. No, that would be too easy. Too traceable. Instead, they were subtle reminders. "I see you. I know what you did. This isn't over." I watched as the calm mask he wore started to crack, little by little. He became more irritable, snapping at my mom over the smallest things. He started locking his office door, double-checking the locks on the windows, looking over his shoulder when he thought no one was watching. But I was always watching. One evening, when my mom was out with friends, I found Grayson alone in the living room, staring blankly at the TV. I stood in the doorway, watching him for a moment before speaking. "Is everything okay, Grayson?" I asked sweetly, tilting my head just enough to make it look innocent. He flinched, his jaw tightening as he forced a smile. "Everything's fine, Reina," he replied, but his voice was strained, the confidence he once had slipping away. I stepped closer, lowering my voice just enough that he had to strain to hear. "You know," I whispered, "you're not as untouchable as you think." His eyes darkened, but he didn't say a word. He didn't have to. I could see the fear in his gaze, the uncertainty gnawing at him. And that was all I needed. The final straw came one night when my mom was asleep upstairs. I waited until the house was silent, until the only sound was the faint hum of the refrigerator. I crept into Grayson's office, using the spare key I'd swiped from his drawer weeks ago. I rifled through his things, looking for anything I could use. Something concrete to finally prove what he'd done. And I found it. Hidden in a locked drawer at the bottom of his desk was a small box. Inside were photos. Photos of me. Some taken inside the house when I wasn't looking, others from outside my bedroom window. My blood ran cold as I flipped through them, each one worse than the last. But I didn't cry. I didn't panic. I took the box and walked straight into my mom's bedroom. She woke with a start, rubbing her eyes as she sat up. "Reina, what are you doing?" It's the middle of the night. I didn't say a word. I just tossed the box onto her lap. Her confusion turned to horror as she flipped through the photos. I watched her face pale, her hands trembling. What is this?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Your perfect husband," I spat, my voice cold. "Still think I was making it up?" She didn't respond. She just stared at the photos, her breathing ragged, her eyes wide with disbelief. Then, from downstairs, we heard it, the sound of Grayson's footsteps. My mom's head snapped up, her eyes meeting mine, and for the first time in months, I saw it. She believed me. The next morning, Grayson was gone. No note, no explanation, just gone. My mom never talked about what happened. She never apologized, never acknowledged how wrong she'd been. But she didn't have to. The empty space where Grayson's things used to be was enough. But for me, it wasn't over. Because every time I looked in the mirror, I saw the girl who survived. And I knew one thing for sure. They thought they broke me. But they were so wrong.